What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today we're going to take a look at the cards that FFG has previewed over the last few days for Shadows of the Galaxy. Let's get right into it. So, first up, we have Boba Fett Daimyo. This is a new leader. This is Heroism Boba, Command Boba. Quite different from the aspects that we've seen on the Boba Fett that represents kind of his presence in the original films. This is Boba Fett from The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett shows. He is a leader that deploys on 6 resources, and he is a 4/7 with the Underworld trait. Each other friendly unit that has 1 or more keywords gets +1 power on his unit side. And on his leader side, when you play a unit that has 1 or more keywords, you may exhaust this leader, and if you do, give a friendly unit +1 power for this phase. Notably, it does not have to be the unit that has the keywords. So you can play a unit that has 1 or more keywords and use this to buff up a different unit that you already have ready. Overall, I think that this is a pretty solid leader. You know, this looks like an ability that's very versatile. There are a lot of different keywords in the game, so we have things like Grit, Saboteur, Sentinel, Raid, you know, the new Bounty keyword, the new Smuggle keyword. There are a lot of keywords in the game, and Boba is going to be able to often use this ability or often get value from it. Even with cards that we're seeing that are already good, commonly played cards. So if you play Echo Base Defender, that has a keyword. It's Sentinel. If you play Green Squadron A-Wing, that has a keyword. It has Raid. If you play Restored Arc 170, that has a keyword. It has Restore. So overall, this ability is going to be pretty easy to use. 4/7 at 6. You know, this is obviously not Cunning Boba's 4/7 at 5, but 4/7 at 6 is basically on curve. Yeah, he isn't above curve like our current Boba Fett leader, but he's still in an overall pretty good spot, and the ability should be pretty easy to use. I think that at least in limited play, this will probably be very solid. It seems easy to build a deck where this is going to get some good value. And in constructed, you know, we'll have to see, but it doesn't look like a total joke or anything. Could be quite interesting. All right. Let's move on to Chrysantan. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Muscle for Hire. This was previewed by Space Arena Ground Arena, and he is a 5-cost 3/7 ground unit who has 2 strong abilities. When played, if an enemy unit has a bounty, you may ready this unit, and on attack, choose a ground unit. You may deal 1 damage to it for each damage on this unit. So the when played, conditional ready is really good. In general, abilities that allow a unit to come into play ready are very, very strong. There's only a few units that currently have these, so we've seen Millennium Falcon, Fett's Fire Spray, and I believe Gorilla Attack Pod, plus anything that you play with Sneak Attack. And these are often really powerful abilities to have in the game, so I think Chrysantan having one of those is a good start. And then his on-attack ability is like a stronger version of Grit as long as you're the one attacking. It doesn't do anything on defense, unlike Grit, but the fact that it's an on-attack ability allows you to, you know, let's say you have 3 damage on Chrysantan. You can potentially attack the enemy base and also deal 3 damage to an enemy ground unit. You can potentially attack 1 ground unit and also deal damage to another one and potentially take out 2 units in 1 attack. It's flexible. You could attack a unit, use the on-attack ability to knock its shield off, and then defeat it with your normal damage. You could attack a unit and use the on-attack ability to just stack up a more powerful hit. Like, overall, it seems quite strong, and I think this is going to be a card that's really good in draft and will also probably see play in constructed decks. You do need to have opposing units with bounty for maximum value, and are people going to actually play the various units that have built-in bounty? I'm not sure. Luckily, you can yourself play those upgrades that give your opponents bounties and use that to enable this ability. Chrysantan also has very strong synergy with a Grand Inquisitor's Ready. He is only 3 power, and because his ability is sort of fake grit instead of real grit, even if his ability is enabling him to do a lot more damage, it does not prevent him from being readied with Grand Inquisitor's ability, since his base power will still be 3. He also has the Underworld, Wookiee, and Bounty Hunter traits, which all might have relevant synergy. Overall, I think this guy's looking very strong. Let's move on to our next preview. We have Guild Target. This is one of the 0-cost bounty upgrades that we've seen in this set. This time it's an aggression upgrade, and it has attached unit gains bounty, deal 2 damage to a base. If this unit is unique, deal 3 damage instead. So 0 for 2-door base, or 3 if the target's unique, seems pretty good. This is the type of thing that aggro decks would, in theory, be very excited about because direct damage to the base is something very useful for them. However, aggro decks often don't want to actually kill enemy units. They want to focus on the base. So there's a little bit of anti-synergy there, where in order to get value out of this, you have to defeat or capture an opposing unit, but aggro decks want to be attacking the base, not the units. However, in some cases, there are units that aggro decks do want to deal with, the most notable ones being units that have Sentinel or have Restore. And so if you're playing aggro and your opponent throws out Yoda, I think probably you have to try and defeat Yoda in order to prevent the opponent from repeatedly healing their base. And as a result of that, things like this could be quite useful in those scenarios where if the opponent plays Yoda, now you put Guild Target on him. And even though you had to attack and defeat Yoda to prevent that Restore from getting a lot of value against you, you still got 3 damage to the opponent's base via Guild Target. Also, let's say the opponent throws down Lieutenant Childson, and now there's this big Sentinel obstacle that you have to clear out. Well, put Guild Target on him, and now the fact that you had to use some stuff to push through this Sentinel is still getting damage onto the opponent's base. And both those cards I just mentioned are unique, so it will do the 3 damage. With Bosk, his ability to double the result of a bounty when deployed could be huge as well. So 0 for 6 if Bosk is on his unit side and you get this bounty, that could be devastating. Overall, I think it's an interesting card. It's kind of an aggro bounty and it's worth testing. So bounties are sort of anti-synergistic with aggro's main game plan, as I discussed before, but there are those situations where you want to clear a unit anyway, and I think this could add a cool new twist to the aggro builds by allowing them to kind of recoup some of the value that's lost by having to have attacks go into units instead of the base. All right. One other note on this card, though, is that it is not heroism, which does mean that there's a bit of anti-synergy with the popular Rebel aggro card for a cause I believe in. That doesn't mean that it's unusable, of course, but it does mean that there's going to be a little more difficulty in fitting it into the existing aggro decks, but we could see this being an important part of other aggro decks. I think for villain aggro with Bosk, this seems very exciting. All right. Next up, we have the Hylaban Enforcer. This was previewed by El Val del Jedi. My apologies for a undoubtedly quite poor pronunciation there. But this is a 1-cost 1/4 Vigilance Villainy Ground unit. It has Grit. This unit gets +1/+0 for each damage on it, and it has Bounty Draw a card. When this unit's defeated or captured, your opponent collects its bounty. So if this is taken out or if it is captured, your opponent is the one who gets to draw a card. So 1 cost for a 1/4 with Grit is very efficient, but Bounty is a real downside. This is basically almost the same card as Scout Bike Pursuer, but for 1 and with Bounty. So let's take a look at Scout Bike Pursuer. So Scout Bike Pursuer, as you can see here, is a 2-cost 1/4 with Grit, and it has the Imperial trait, but it is exactly the same card, except it doesn't have the bounty. It's Imperial and Trooper instead of being Underworld, and yeah, it costs 2 instead of 1. So going back to the Hylaban Enforcer here, I'm overall not sure this is good unless you have another 1-cost. There's sort of this issue with all these 1-cost, but they have bounty units, where if you play these on the first turn and you don't have another thing that costs 1, you waste a resource. And the fact that you wasted that resource means that you aren't really gaining a benefit from having an extra cheap unit. Now, if you play this and another 1-cost unit, then it feels like, oh, nice, I'm ahead. But if you play this, don't have something else to play with your resource, well, maybe you should have just played the Scout Bike Pursuer instead. It does make the Hylaban Enforcer does make a better gap filler in later turns if you end up a bit like slightly below curve. Like let's say you're on 5 resources and you end up playing a 4-cost card and you have 1 resource left. You could use that resource to play out the Hylaban Enforcer and get another body on the field. That is one thing that it does better than the Scout. But overall, I'm not sure there's going to be enough 1-costs to make these strong. If there are, though, it could be a scary kind of weenie rush type style where you put out a lot of weaker cards early in the game, and the fact that some of them have these bounties that allow the opponent to draw or whatever, like, yeah, they might be gaining extra value when they clear them, but you're sort of overwhelming them in the short term in a way that will hopefully get you the win anyway. So yeah, not sure where this one will end up, but it's an interesting idea at the very least. Let's move on to our next preview, Freetown Backup, also previewed by El Val the Jedi, though I erroneously had 2 L's there, and that is my mistake, I believe. This is a 2-cost Command Heroism ground unit is a 1/4 with the fringe trait. On attack, it gives another friendly unit +2/+2 for this phase. It also has Smuggle, so it can be played for 4 from the resource zone. And if you do that, you replace it with the top card of your deck. So that's essentially a way to play it from the resource zone and not use a card. In exchange, it costs more. Yeah, so the smuggle here isn't that exciting. It's inefficient, but it doesn't cost a card. Maybe you're going to do it sometimes. It's a 2-cost 1/4. The fact that it buffs a unit after it attacks, or on attack rather, can be quite good. But it suffers a bit because its ability does say another friendly unit. So we see a very similar ability on Steadfast Battalion, but Steadfast Battalion does not say another. So taking a look at Steadfast Battalion here, if you control a leader unit, give a friendly unit +2/+2 for this phase on attack. And that version of the ability is a lot better because we've commonly seen Steadfast Battalion being used to give itself the +2/+2 because just a friendly unit, not another unit. You can buff it up to 7/7, and at a 7/7 stat line, that's enough to do some very major damage. Going back to our Freetown backup, the fact that it's another friendly unit means this is more of a support piece rather than something that can really brawl with enemy units with that buff. The lack of the Rebel trait also hurts it a bit for the current Heroism aggro builds that have a lot of Rebel synergies with cards like Metal Ceremony, Fleet Lieutenant, Wing Leader. However, the 1/4 stat line is difficult to remove. It could be an annoying support card, but in general, this sort of ability is, I think, a little worse than it seems because when you buff that other friendly unit, your opponent has a chance to interfere with it before it gets to make that attack. So maybe you attack with your Freetown backup and you buff, I don't know, a Green Squadron A-Wing, and now your A-Wing is potentially hitting for 5. Well, if your opponent plays a takedown to kill your A-Wing, then you lost the value of the buff because the fact that this game has such a back and forth dynamic means that the opponent has a chance to interfere with these sorts of things before you make your attack. Um, that doesn't mean this card's bad. I don't think it's like the most exciting ever, but it's not garbage. The 2-cost 1/4 stat line can be like annoying for opponents to remove, and you can potentially use this to buff other cards, which will then in turn make them potentially more difficult to remove. It does give the +2 HP. So we've seen like Benthic 2 Tubes who gives a friendly unit raid 2. This is a better version of that because not only does this buff apply on defense, but it also increases their HP, which makes them less vulnerable to certain removal, or even if the opponent plays like an open fire that would defeat your unit, maybe the temporary HP lets it make one more attack before it's removed. So I don't know. I'm not thrilled with this card, but I don't think it's garbage. I think it might be a solid option for limited, and I can potentially even see it seeing constructed play depending on what else we see in the set. Let's move on to Jango Fett, Renowned Bounty Hunter. This was an FFG preview. Jango is a 4-cost aggression villainy ground unit. He is a 3/6. This is on curve. Those are good stats. And he has 2 very strong abilities. First up, while attacking a unit with a bounty, he gets +3 power and gains Overwhelm. This means that he is essentially a 6/6 when attacking into a unit with bounty, and Overwhelm means he can do some damage to the base as well. Also, when this unit attacks and defeats a unit, you draw a card. So this is, just some card draw that you can get for taking out enemy units with Jango. The bonus damage and Overwhelm against bounty targets is, first off, it's really good against those built-in bounty type units. But keep in mind that you can give enemy units bounties with the various bounty upgrades that we've seen, and that means that Jango's ability doesn't necessarily rely on your opponent playing certain cards. You can enable it yourself. Drawing a card when you defeat an opposing unit on the attack is, that's a very solid. Card draw isn't as good in this game as in some other card games, but it's still like a quite nice thing to have. And in this case, it might make up for you playing some of those cheap bounty cards, which could otherwise deplete your hand quickly. So if you put one of those 0-cost bounties on a target, then you attack with Jango. That enables Jango's ability, but you did have to spend a card to do that. However, Jango lets you draw that card right back. And it isn't contingent on attacking a unit with a bounty. So in a situation where, I don't know, let's say the opponent plays an Echo-based defender and you attack and defeat it with Jango, you still draw a card, even if that Echo-based defender had no bounty on it whatsoever. So overall, Jango looks like a great way to deal with bounty units. His stats are very good for the cost. 6 HP means he's out of range of a lot of removal options. Forced Choke will not kill him in one hit. Takedown will not be able to defeat him unless he already takes some damage. He has strong synergy with Grand Inquisitor's Ready ability because he is only 3 base power. Overall, I expect this to see pretty widespread play. I think the stats that you get here are really good, and the abilities are also quite powerful. Let's move on to our next preview, Modded Cohort. This was previewed by Hannons. It is a 4-cost 2/4 command heroism ground unit with ambush and raid 2. So 4-cost 2/4 is a bad stat line. 2/4 is a bad stat line even at 3-cost, but ambush and raid 2 more than compensate, and I think this unit ends up looking quite strong. So reliably ambushing for 4 damage or 5 damage if you have Boba Fett Daimyo to give it +1 power for having a keyword seems great. A 4-cost ambush for 4 with 4 HP is often going to be able to pick off an enemy unit and stay alive. So, if your opponent, let's say turn 3, your opponent plays Ezra Bridger, 3-cost 3/4. Okay. Or at turn 2, they play Ezra Bridger, 3-cost 3/4. Turn 3, you ambush Ezra with the modded cohort, defeat him in 1 shot, and the modded cohort is still alive with 1 HP. Similarly, you can pick off the Cell Block Guard. You could pick off Emperor's Royal Guard, unless it's a Palpatine deck. The ambushing for 4 is pretty solid, and your 4 HP means you have a good chance to remain alive. Now, the fact that your damage is based on raid does mean that you're going to be left with only 2 power on the defense afterwards, which does leave you a bit vulnerable, but the opponent will likely have to at least spend an attack or another card to deal with you in a lot of situations. I think the core efficiency here is very high. I think this is going to be an excellent card in limited play, so draft and sealed. I think this is going to be great, and I think it's likely going to be playable in Premier as well, to be honest with you. It will work extra well if you have Sentinels to cover it. So let's say you ambush and take out a unit, and now you have a Sentinel that makes it so that their units can't attack the modded cohort, and you have a better chance of being able to get another swing for 4. That seems really favorable to me, and it might benefit from other Underworld synergies as well. Overall, I think this card looks really solid, excellent kind of French vanilla card where it doesn't have any fancy abilities, but the stats and keywords make it have a quite interesting role. Let's move on to Hannon's other preview card, and probably a much more controversial one, Boba Fett's Armor. This is a 2-cost cunning upgrade attached to a non-vehicle unit. If attached unit is Boba Fett and damage would be dealt to him, prevent 2 of that damage, and it also gives +2/+2. So this works on any version of Boba Fett. So you can play this on Boba Fett Daimyo, you can play this on Boba Fett collecting the bounty, you can play this on Boba Fett Disintegrator. If they have another new unit Boba, it will work on that too. This ability is extremely strong and it's highly versatile. It doesn't just apply to combat damage. So if the opponent plays open fire targeting your Boba, it only does 2 damage. It notably doesn't work on -X/-X or defeat abilities. So, if Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight gives you -6/-6 and you only had 6 HP left, you're dead even though you have this damage reduction, as I understand it. But it's still a really, really good ability. And 2 for a +2/+2 upgrade is on curve. We've seen other upgrades, like Academy Training is not a totally terrible card. I've even seen it in some constructed decks. Cards like Electro Staff that have a somewhat conditional ability and 2 for +2/+2 also see some play. And this damage reduction on Boba is much better than the ability on Electro Staff, to be honest with you. I think this is actually the most controversial preview we've seen because, quite frankly, Boba doesn't really seem to need the help. Looking at Boba Fett collecting the bounty, which is our current leader Boba, and Boba Fett Disintegrator, both of these actually probably came in above the curve. So Boba Fett collecting the bounty is a 5 deploy leader with 4/7 stats. Other 4/7 leaders are at 6 resources. Boba Fett Disintegrator is a 3-cost 3/5 with a strong ability. Other 3-cost units tend to only have 7 points of stats, not 8. So 3-cost 3/4 might be more appropriate, at least in terms of other cards that we've seen in the game. So this is kind of an interesting one because you get a buff that applies to units that are you get a buff card here that applies to units that are already performing really well. And so it feels a little bit like the rich get richer with this one. Now, I will say this was probably designed before set 1. So at the time that they were designing and confirming this card for set 2, I don't think they knew how strong Boba was necessarily going to be in set 1. Or, I don't know, maybe they knew and they thought, there's going to be some other stuff that's really going to make Boba a lot worse in the future, and this card is going to kind of make up for it. I do think it's a cool effect, and it works with an iconic character. And it'll be interesting to see how this works with different versions of Boba Fett, but I do think this one's a bit controversial just because at present, Boba's already in a really strong place. He already has Fett's Fire Spray as another card that synergizes with him in particular, and it seems a little odd to get another very strong card that synergizes with him in particular, even though it's very characterful in the lore and so on. it does seem a little odd to give another buff to someone that's in such a strong spot. But, you know, they didn't know what this meta was going to look like at the time that they were designing this card. And of course, there's also the potential for them to make balance changes or whatever as they see fit. I don't think this card is also like some totally insane card that's going to ruin the game. It has a lot of counters. There's a bunch of upgrade removal. And if anything, I think people are going to be playing more upgrade removal in set 2 because there are going to be a lot more upgrades, as we've already seen with some of the bounty things and so on. So I don't think this card is like totally ludicrous, but I do think, you know, a bit controversial because it buffs Boba, who's already in a good spot. All right. Next up, Grief Karga, Affable Commissioner. This was previewed by Fantasy Flight Games. 2-cost, 2/2 heroism ground unit that can search the top 5 cards of your deck for an upgrade, reveal it, and draw it when played. He is notably S, which is special rarity. It used to be called starter rarity, but it's now special rarity. So this guy is likely in the Mandalorian starter deck. It has a pretty fitting lore and rules synergy with the Mandalorian's overall upgrade focus. I do think it might suffer a bit because upgrade synergy tends to be maybe lower value than some of the other synergies that we've seen. So like Mon Mothma is a similar unit but draws rebels. And there are a lot of rebels in most of the decks that are playing Mon Mothma. Searching for an upgrade instead of a rebel, it's going to be tougher because you likely are playing substantially fewer upgrades than you would play rebels. That said, it has a fitting lore and rule synergy with the Mandalorian's focus on upgrades. I think if you can make a strong upgrade with a lot, or a strong deck with a lot of upgrades, he is cool. And it's worth noting also, so one downside that I have seen discussed is, well, what if you have a lot of upgrades, but you don't have a card to buff with them? One thing to note is that some upgrades will be debuffs, things that you play on your opponent's units. And so, for instance, this is a very fitting character lore-wise to find some bounties to throw onto opponent's units. And that will function even if you don't have a good friendly target for the upgrades themselves. I think if we see a deck, the thing is, I think we're going to want to see like 10 or more upgrades in a deck for this guy to be like really reliable. And right now, there aren't very many decks that are running 10 or more upgrades, but maybe with the Mandalorian's ability to exhaust opponents when you play upgrades, you are going to have a deck with a ton of upgrades, and this guy is going to be a reliable way to draw a card when played and get an upgrade that can help you out in the future. Overall, I'm not thrilled with him. I think I would probably rather have Mon Mothma's 1/3 stats than this guy's 2/2 stats for this type of unit. Although I don't know, maybe not. Maybe the ability to hit for 2 is a little better. Overall, though, I don't think he's like a flashy, exciting card necessarily, but I think he might have a solid role to play in a deck that has a lot of upgrades in it and wants to draw them more consistently in order to use things like the Mandalorian's ability. So overall, I think not like, oh, 10 out of 10, this guy's the best, but I think he will likely have a relevant, helpful role in the Mandalorian starter deck and maybe in constructed decks also. The question is just going to be whether you have the upgrade count to make this guy like consistent and effective enough. All right. Next up, we have Criminal Muscle. This was also previewed by FFG. This guy is a 1-cost 2/1 ground unit in Cunning. He has the Underworld trait, and when played, you may return a non-unique upgrade to its owner's hand. So this is going to bounce an upgrade. So the stats aren't really good for the cost. You can get 4 points of stats at 1 resource. So this guy has 3 points of stats. So you're mostly playing this for the ability. This will permanently remove experience and shields if targeted. So experience and shields are upgrades, and if they are sent to the owner's hand, they're actually just defeated. So that's quite helpful, and you can use this to negate a shield and also have a body on the board. You can potentially bounce more expensive upgrade cards to hand, either friendly or enemy. So this could be used, for instance, if your opponent plays Traitorous on one of your units, you can play Criminal Muscle, bounce their Traitorous back to hand. They probably don't have enough resources to replay Traitorous, so you get your unit back. You also developed another unit that you can fight with later on, and you have a bunch of resources left. So very solid counter to something like that. So good against the expensive enemy upgrades. You can also potentially use this to move your own upgrades. So let's say that you had a card that was buffing one of your units and you had already attacked with that unit. You could potentially play the Criminal Muscle, take your own upgrade back to hand, put it on another unit, and then have that unit attack and get the benefits of the upgrades as well. I think this guy especially synergizes with McClunky to get a repeated effect. So McClunky is a card that allows you to bounce an Underworld card to deal damage. And so you could play this guy, return an enemy upgrade, play McClunky, deal that damage, bounce this guy back to hand, and now if they play their upgrade again, you can play the Criminal Muscle again and send it right back. So that seems like a good little synergy there. Overall, I think this is definitely kind of a tech card. This is a card that exists in large part to answer upgrades and isn't going to be very good without that. But given that this is an upgrade-heavy set, given that experience and shields are upgrades, there are already some good uses for this guy. I could see this guy seeing play in some decks that already exist, and I think that for a set that has a focus on upgrades, this could easily be something that ends up seeing fairly common play. All right. Next up, we have the Frontier Trader, which was previewed by Garbage Rollers. The Frontier Trader, fittingly for Garbage Rollers, is a Jawa. He is a 3-cost 2/2 ground unit. When played, you may return a unit you control to its owner's hand. If you do, you may put the top card of your deck into play as a resource. So these are really, really bad stats for the cost. So 3 for a 2/2 is pretty terrible, unfortunately. At a 3, so like 2 for a 2/2 would be pretty bad, unless it had like strong abilities to make up for it. At 3 cost, what you're really looking for in terms of stats is like 7 points of stats. So you would be looking for like a 3/4 or a 4/3. Something like that. So 3 for a 2/2 is really bad, but you get to trade a resource. So you can return a resource you control to its owner's hand and then put your top card into play as a resource. So is this ability worth the bad stats? I don't know. So I think it's the most positive in the late game. You can trade an endgame card for a weak card. Like, let's say that you're like, okay, I resourced home one early in the game when it wasn't relevant. And now we're in the end game, and the remaining cards in my deck are probably going to be worse than home one. So when I play the Frontier Trader, I get to get my home one back, and I'll replace it with something else that is probably worse than it from the top of the deck. It is worth noting that this ability is also a card draw. So, or it's not directly a card draw, but it's, you get the resource card, and the replacement isn't from hand, it's from the top of the deck. So you do have that going for it. Now, card draw isn't that important in this game, which makes this a bit worse. And I do think it's possible it might be better just to play more endgame stuff. So especially Lando. Let's take a look at Lando here. So Lando is an expensive card. He's a 6-cost, 6/5 with Saboteur, and when played, you can return up to 2 friendly resources to their owner's hands. So if you're in that situation where it's like, oh, I resourced this good card, and now I want to get it back later in the game, you could play Lando, who has way better stats for cost, and get that card back. Now, Lando does deramp you, though, because you return those resources and don't replace them. So it's possible that you really need the Jawa so that you can replace that resource and still have that enabled. And also, Lando doesn't see all that much play. So it could be that this Frontier Trader is going to be a better version of the effect. Overall, I'm just not sure that the flexibility of that like targeted draw from your resource zone is going to be worth the very bad stats here, but we're going to have to see how it goes. I think it's at the very least, I think this is a cool effect, if nothing else. You do have that ability to potentially resource certain cards that are good later in the game with more confidence, because you're like, hey, I don't have to keep this in my hand in case I don't draw another one. With cards like this, I can potentially resource it early, and then later on I'll have some options to pull it back to hand and use it if the game goes that far. I do think it's cool. I don't know if it's better than Lando. I note that people aren't really playing Lando right now. I'm not sure this guy's going to see play. I do think that he's better in the limited format, where you might have very few like big endgame cards in limited. Like, let's say you have like 1 or 2 big battleships in a draft deck and you see one on the first turn. Keeping that in your hand the whole time is going to be pretty annoying. If you resource it and then are like, my Frontier Trader will get this back when the time comes, that could be fairly solid. So yeah, overall, I don't love it. I'm not sure it's going to be good, but at the very least, it's an interesting ability. It could be cool, and we'll have to see how it goes. Next up, we have Dr. Pershing, Experimenting with Life, also a Garbage Rollers preview. This guy is a 2-cost Vigilance Villainy ground unit. He is a 0/5, and as an action, he can exhaust to deal 1 damage to a friendly unit and draw a card. So 2-cost 0/5 is a totally non-aggressive stat line, but it is on curve. Like 5 points of stats is on curve for a 2 cost. Would it be better as a 1/4? Probably, but whatever. He has this sort of support ability that lets you damage friendly units to draw a card. Now, it doesn't say another friendly unit, so I think this works on himself. I think he can exhaust, deal 1 damage to himself, and then draw up a card. And this can also be an enabler for Grit, for Krennic's ability that buffs your own units if they're damaged and that sort of thing. So honestly, this guy seems like he's going to be quite strong to me. He is in a support role. So this is not someone that you want to play to brawl with enemy units. And in fact, enemy units can just hit him for free because he has no power of his own. So if the opponent wants to remove this guy, they can focus on him with their attacks and remove him pretty fast. But 5 HP is a lot. And even if he's even if he uses his ability once and damages himself, goes down to 4 HP. Most early game stuff is only hitting for 2 or 3. They're not going to be able to clear him in one shot. So that's potentially going to be 1 or 2 draws that you'll get from this guy, even if your opponent's trying to deal with him in a lot of situations. I think he's likely going to be quite strong with Director Krennic builds where his ability can enable some strong synergy, and he might have other synergies later as well. I do think he suffers a bit from, as I've said before, card draw is not as valuable in this game as in some other games, but I do think that there's real potential here, and this card looks exciting. I think Director Krennic would already be pretty excited to field this, and I think there are other decks that might end up running it as well, depending on how things go. There's also another card that synergizes with Grand Inquisitor because you can play him, use Grand Inquisitor to damage him, and then use his ability to draw a card immediately. Lots of Grand Inquisitor synergies this set, though of course doing that does leave him even more vulnerable to being removed. One note also is that this sort of stat line is extremely vulnerable to ambush because an opponent can hit him with an ambush unit and take no damage in return, and that can be pretty nasty even for some of the ambush units that are more vulnerable. So that Chain Code Collector that's a 4/2, for instance, if Pershing has used his ability once to draw a card and damaged himself, he's now a 0/4. The Chain Code Collector can show up, take him out, and remain alive, which is, pretty good for your opponent. But if you have Sentinels and stuff to cover for this guy, it might be harder to remove him, and he could draw you a lot of cards. All right. And I believe, last but not least, for this set of previews, we have the Village Protectors. This was showed on the Asmodee Instagram account. It is a 3-cost 2/2 ground unit in Vigilance Heroism with Sentinel and Shielded. So 2/2 stats are well below the curve, but Sentinel and Shielded are good keywords. It's an interesting layout overall, and I think it could be really annoying for your opponent if they don't have a direct counter to it, because being Sentinel and Shielded, if the opponent doesn't have something other than just basic attacks, they're going to end up using at least 2 attacks to clear this. 1 to remove the shield, 1 to actually take out the unit. That being said, a lot of things do get around this. So if someone plays Make an Opening and gives it -2/-2, it just is defeated through the shield. If someone has a Saboteur unit, they can attack it, defeat the shield, and likely defeat it in the same hit. Sabine Wren, Explosives Artist, can attack it, deal 1 damage with the on-attack ability, then deal 2 damage with her normal attack. The 1 damage clears the shield, the 2 damage defeats the unit. As a result, I'm not sure this is going to be worth playing in constructed formats. There are just kind of too many things that seem like they answer it, but I think it's going to be annoying in limited, at least, where those things are less likely to be there. Limited decks tend to have worse removal, and there's a good chance this is going to be able to absorb at least 2 attacks. Also, it might see constructed play. I'm not sure. Maybe we're going to see a lot more shielded synergy cards. Maybe you play this and then you play Rose Tico, and if the opponent didn't clear your shield, you attack with Rose, swap the shield for an experience. Now you got a 4/4 Sentinel for 4, or a 4/4 Sentinel for 3, which is a really good deal. Is that going to be reliable? Probably not. But I think it's at least conceivable that there will be synergies that make this sort of thing strong. The art recalls a specific episode of The Mandalorian Season 1, which is cool to see. And overall, I think, at least in limited, this is going to be a pretty annoying Sentinel for opponents to deal with. There are definitely counters, and in constructed, I think it's more likely this will run into its counters. But at least for limited, I think it'll be solid. And who knows, maybe it'll see some constructed play as well. All right. So that's going to do it for this set of previews, guys. I'm curious, which of these is your favorite? And feel free to chime in the comments below with your own thoughts on these cards. If you think that I evaluated one of these really wrong, maybe you think that Jawa's really strong, maybe you think Jango is actually a lot worse than he looks. Whatever it is, hey, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm curious to know what others think of these previews. And yeah. It's been an exciting preview season thus far, and I'm going to continue bringing out, new videos discussing new preview cards, as well as YouTube shorts for the new previews and some of the more traditional video content as well. I have some upcoming stuff with regard to comparing and contrasting the different colors for different Sabine builds and so on. So yeah, thanks to y'all for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.